With a little book introducing Deleuze and Guattari, why did I choose these particular concepts? Because Deleuze and Guattari's work is full of often quite complicated ideas. Well, I wanted just to choose the ones that planners are more likely to encounter and to use in their practice and their research. So rather than try and cover everything that Deleuze and Guattari talk about, I just chose some main topics that I thought were relative to planning or relevant to planning and the ideas that are associated with them. I'm also thinking about what can these concepts do rather than what they are. And that's a very Deleuze and Guattarian approach. They're more interested in what something can do than what it is. What can something do for planning practitioners, for planning researchers? So I start off with looking at assemblage. Assemblage is becoming more used in geography and it's gradually creeping into spatial planning. So it's a word that researchers and scholars and practitioners will be familiar with perhaps. An assemblage is a network or a group of related elements. So cities are assemblages, bodies are assemblages, both non-human bodies like trees, mountains, and human bodies. We're all assemblages made up of different parts that are related to each other. So the idea of relationality is also important. So I talk about assemblages, and related to that, the idea of territorialization. For Deleuze, territorialization is a form of action on forces, and these can be social forces, economic forces, political forces, that limits their possibilities for action. So territorialization is a capture, a limiting of forces for action. It puts boundaries around them. And related to this, there's the idea of lines of flight. When groups like resident action groups get fed up with something, they may decide they've had enough and they break away to try and do something else. The idea of a line of flight is that it unpacks or deterritorializes what was previously bounded and limited, and they break it apart, they leave it. But then usually they enforce their own rules, their own systems, and they re-territorialize into something different. And the final concept in the first chapter is the idea of a rhizome. A rhizome, the best example would be a piece of ginger. It's a root that spreads in all directions. It's non-hierarchical. So it's not it's not a tree. So it spreads and is connected in all different directions. And that again is important for Deleuze and Guattari, the idea of relationality, of connections, rather than of rigid hierarchies. The second chapter is about space, because Deleuze and Guattari's is a geospatial, a geophilosophy. It's a spatial philosophy. And obviously planning is to do with space. It's all about planning space. And Deleuze and Guattari, their two main concepts related to space are the smooth and the striated. Smooth space is more composed chaos, it's chaotic space. If we're thinking about material, it would be felt, something matted together or perhaps knotted together in almost a random way rather than woven. Striated space is regulated space, it's ordered space, it's more a woven form of material. So streets with their grid patterns are striated space. A more organic, messy space would be smooth space. Deleuze and Guattari talk about the sea as being a smooth space par excellence. We could also add the wind or the air, something like that. The third chapter introduces another of Deleuze and Guattari's main ideas. This is the idea of a machine. A machine is an assemblage of parts that works and produces. So they use the term machine because it comes from machining, to make, to produce. So it doesn't mean it's a box or something like that. The idea is, if we think of the verb, machines make, machines produce. And there are lots of different kinds of machines. For instance, there are technological machines. A house is a technological machine for living, as Le Corbusier famously once said. There are concrete machines of laws and regulations. They all produce something. And especially for Deleuze and Guattari, the idea of the abstract machine. And the abstract machine is quite complex, and I hope I've explained it simply enough. It's the immanent relations that constitute a particular machine, a particular process, or a particular assemblage. So the abstract machine is the immanent relations, the underlying relations, the relations that emerge. Capital is an abstract machine that underlies a lot of processes, a lot of assemblages. In this chapter, I also introduce the idea of planes. And this is, for me, is one of Deleuze and Guattari's main concepts that we can use in spatial planning. In French, a plane is a plan, P-L-A-N, which also means a plan, a scheme, a project, or a cinematic shot. And these can be long shots or they can be close-ups. And here again, Deleuze and Guattari use the word plan or plane in all of its manifestations. In particular, for me, there are two planes that are important. These are the plane of immanence, and this is a plane where things are composed. It's a plane of virtuality, open-ended trajectories. It's unstructured, smooth space. It's a plane of chance. Much more longer term if we were to translate it into planning aspects. And the other plane is the plane of organisation. This is a plane of closed goals, a plane of hierarchical power relations, a plane of policy development, a plane of planning, in fact, of regulated, striated space. And this is what I will take through in the final chapter to develop into ideas about a methodology for planning practice, for strategic planning practice. In chapter 4, I wanted to look at the ideas of nature. Now, Deleuze himself said very little about nature in his work. Guattari, on the other hand, was an activist who was really involved with nature and the environment, and he wrote quite a lot. His most famous book is The Three Ecologies, and his ideas became known as ecosophy. While there aren't many people, many scholars, many researchers who've really looked at the ideas of nature, I think that, and Deleuze and Guattari's work, I think that they offer us quite a lot if we think about spatial planning. Apart from the obvious links with ecology and environment, there's what's coming through is the idea of nature, of things having power. Jane Bennett famously used the term thing power. If we think about how water floods, rivers flood, sea level is rising, so the oceans are flooding, and the effects on humans and non-humans that this happens, we can see that nature has power. The same in Australia and North America with the idea of salinity and dust bowls. Farmers decide they want to cut down all the trees, and as a result of this, the topsoil is not anchored and can become very saline. And nature speaks in its own way. Nature can take its revenge, if you like, on us. So things have power, and this is something that Deleuze and Guattari would totally agree with. And what I think is important for planners is to realise it's not just us as humans that can have power, that we can do powerful things. And we're finding out with climate change that nature can have power too. I bring this all together in the last chapter in the book, which is what can spatial planning do? And here I build on the work of the two planes that I just mentioned. And the United Nations and various other organisations have actually said that it's quite a good idea in terms of trying to work with uncertainty, that we have two different kinds of plans that have two different kinds of functions. One of these I base on the plane of immanence. This would be a strategic plan, a vision, a trajectory for the longer term, which gives flexibility. So we have broad aims and objectives, something like sustainability, multiculturalism, habitability, which are flexible, within which we can devise more detailed structure plans, development plans for shorter terms that actually give us the detail in how we're going to get the city to be sustainable and so on. So from the plane of immanence, I draw the idea of longer term plans. And from the plane of organisation, as you probably already guessed, the idea of shorter term, more local plans, development plans, which are hierarchically organised, and they are something to which ideas and projects are submitted in judgment. And so to sum up, I think that these few concepts from Deleuze and Guattari will actually offer both spatial planning researchers and scholars and practitioners quite a lot to work with.